this session. The recording from these webinars, we normally would place onto our website. We do remove the chat component of the recording. So questions that people ask, we will trim out. So don't be afraid of speaking up if you want to. And I do encourage you to actually ask questions during the webinar. While it is billed as a webinar, we treat them a bit more like an informal kind of workshop and discussion session. So don't be afraid to say, oh, I didn't understand what you said, or to ask for clarification. And I'd be happy to stop and talk about any particular points. Sorry, I'm not sure why that slide is advancing so quickly. Let me give you some general disclaimers about me. The last point there is probably no surprise to anybody, particularly those who know me. I do have a tendency to go on a bit when I'm speaking, but I'll go back to the start. I am a health economist, and I have a mix of, in my background, I did actually start in academia many years ago before going into industry. So I've had experience of both the industry and the academic side and the consultancy side, typically always working in the cancer space and in how we make cancer medicines and cancer treatments available to patients, either in the context of trials or through funded access in terms of funding via the MBS and PBS. So at the moment, I wear a number of hats here at the Centre for Health Economics Research and Evaluation at UTS. One of those is the work that I do with CREST through the Cancer Australia work, and I lead that program of work, and I'll tell you a bit more about CREST in a moment for those of you who are new to CREST. The other main hat I work is doing work under Shares Evaluation Services for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, where I'm one of the senior evaluators in that team, where we look at applications to PBAC. And that combination of hats gives not only me, but our team a really nice view of kind of both spectrums of how we make medicines and healthcare available in this country, because it gives us an overview of what's required to collect data and the types of data that we need, and then how those data are then analysed and thought about by the decision makers when they're going to actually decide whether or not something should be funded or recommended for funding by government. So Lutfen already let us know that this is going to be recorded. So unless you're going to ask a question, do please keep yourself on mute. That's important so we don't get too much background noise. If you're going to ask a question, you can do it in the chat or raise your hand, and hopefully I'll see those. At some point, we'll probably take a pic, probably at the end. So if you're happy for us to do that, just turn your video on. And I do want to thank Lutfen, with whom you may have communicated, for helping to set up this series. I do want to just give you a little bit of a background about who CREST are, what we do. For those of you who don't know, we are a service that's supported by Cancer Australia to provide health economics advice and service to the 14 cancer cooperative clinical trials groups. And you can see here the 3 pillars under which we provide that advice and that service. One is as a technical advice where we essentially work with the groups who are seeking to implement a new clinical trial or a new protocol, to think about, well, what data are we collecting? How are we collecting that information? How might we interpret the advice, the data that we gather, so that we can then think about going to reimbursement authorities to say, well, this represents value for money. This should be paid for, and that might be a reimbursement authority at the federal level, it might be someone at the state level, it might be even someone at a local level. But essentially, it's about ensuring that the right data are being collected to answer the questions about value at the end. And we do that by looking at written documents, we do that by attending meetings, we go to concept development or idea generation workshops and get involved right at the outset when things are being thought about in terms of development, just to be engaged in thinking about, are we collecting the right information in the right way? We've got a whole range of support resources available on our website in terms of not only background documents, which we call fact sheets, which give you information on a number of things like Medicare data, like what it takes to conduct an economic evaluation, the costs involved in conducting an economic evaluation. But we also have some pro forma, if you like, CRFs, case report forms, for collecting resource use information alongside a trial. We have tools for the analysis of quality of life data for economic evaluations. They're on our website. And we have a quarterly newsletter, which gives you highlights about what's happening here at CREST, but also among the groups, among the CTGs. We have webinars like this one, which we then post on the website, and you'll also find our previous webinars on our website, along with our longer format workshops, which some of them are one-day workshops on a number of issues, ranging from how to incorporate health economics into a clinical trial, all the way to, well, how do we ask people about their preferences for healthcare and different ways of receiving healthcare in a way that we can then use that information to determine value. All of that leads into that final pillar about capacity building, where we do things like workshops. We also have drop-in clinics, which run once a month, which are a service that anybody can come along to. It's a Zoom-based service where we have the Zoom open, and anyone who's got a question about health economics alongside a cancer clinical trial can attend that and ask their question. We have a mentoring program where a researcher who has some data that they're not sure about how to analyse from a health economics perspective can be partnered with a mentor here at the centre under what we call a structured training opportunity, and that allows them to get that capacity in terms of the data analysis and then producing some sort of output. And of course, we have lots of kind of interactions with the groups, be it as part of meetings or going to conferences, where we can provide that capacity building in a more informal way. So that's just about CREST. But one of the things we set up for this year, as in response to questions that we had from a number of the groups last year and the year before, was to look at this question about health technology assessment and to try and give everybody a bit of a perspective about what that is in the context of in the context of what we're doing here in the clinical trial and cancer research space. And we're doing that through these 3 webinars, which you can see outlined here on the slide, and I hope everybody can actually see the slides. In today's session, I'm going to give you an overview of what health technology assessment is and give you some examples of what that is. Next week, the session is going to be delivered by Joe Watson, and Joe is currently the deputy to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Deputy Chair to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. She's also the chair of the Commonwealth Consumer Consultative Committee and has been a long-time consumer advocate in Australia. And if anybody has seen her speak before, you'll know she's a very engaged and engaging speaker. So if you haven't already registered for that, I would encourage you to do so. That should be a very fantastic session about how consumer inputs are incorporated into health technology assessment, and importantly, how consumers can be involved in health technology assessment in Australia. The final session will be towards the middle of March, and I'll be delivering that, and that will be particularly around the inputs from how inputs from clinical trials are incorporated into health technology assessment. I'll be touching on some of that today, but I don't want to double up too much today on what I'll be covering in a few weeks' time. So I'll save most of that for the middle of March. Okay, so we've all seen headlines like this, and having just come from ASCO GU, believe me, there were lots of statements like this where everybody wants to find a cure for some type of cancer, and we think that the next medicine is going to be the new hope to do so, and that we're going to find the next great blockbuster to make everybody better. But the question that always comes to my mind and to the mind of many in this sector is, well, does this thing actually work in the way that they're telling me it works? And I'm going to also be asking very, very importantly, is it safe to give? Because in many occasions, something might look like it works, but it comes at a great cost in terms of burden to the patient, in terms of either how they're having to access the care, that's not really necessarily a safety issue, but in terms of adverse events and having an impact on them in an adverse impact in terms of their health. I'm then going to think about, well, if I look at what's coming out of this treatment, does it actually represent a good use of the healthcare resource? Does it represent value for money? Could I use those resources in a better way than what this new medicine represents? And importantly, is this new drug or this new service available, going to be available to those who are most likely to benefit? Or is it going to be, do we have to use it on everybody, which means it's going to be wasted for some people? Or do we just not know who's going to be benefit the most from this drug? These are really, really critical questions that if we kind of leave it up to what we call the market, they're often not going to be answered. So we need some sort of systematic approach to try and address all of these questions in a way that is not only makes sense for a particular drug in front of us at a given point in time, but allows us to make consistent results across medicines, across different forms of delivering healthcare, and allows us to know that, yes, we're being consistent in our decision-making. And that's really where health technology assessment comes in that it gives us that framework that allows us to do that. So through today's webinar, what I hope we will get out of it and what I hope you will take away from it is to understand basically what we're talking about when we're talking about a health technology, to understand that process for health technology assessment. And then I'll take you through an example of health technology assessment in Australia. And we're going to look at the PBAC process writ large, so the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee writ large, and then a particular example of the funding of drugs for metastatic melanoma as a little bit of a case study of how they were funded for a couple of the drugs in that indication. So when we think about health technology, we're thinking about advances that we're making in how we provide and arrange healthcare for basically hopefully making people feel better, either in terms of alleviating an existing health issue or preventing some future health issue. What often comes to mind for many of us are medicines and drugs, but it includes the whole gamut of health interventions and health delivery, such as diagnostics. We've got medical and surgical procedures. They are certainly technologies. The way that we might screen people, and there's been a lot of media lately about new methods of lung cancer screening and potentially introducing those. We might be thinking about different types of therapeutic goods and services like nutritions. We've got prostheses, which are certainly a technology, and even things like counselling and telemedicine. We can all think about those as types of health technologies, which could be subject to a HTA process. Amongst all of that, and given the advances that we're seeing in technology, we have some challenges that are influencing how we think about the assessment of these technologies. One, and particularly in the cancer space, this one has been an emerging challenge for a number of years, is this concept of codependent or even hybrid technologies. And this is where the efficacy of one technology depends on the efficacy of another technology. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that we've got a drug that treats a particular mutation in a cancer. I'll give you so let's say we've got a mutation for chronic myeloid leukemia, and we've got a drug that turns off that particular mutation. We want to be able to use that drug in people who have that mutation. So we need a test that's going to accurately detect individuals who have that mutation so we can use that drug in those individuals. So how effective the drug is depends on being able to identify correctly those individuals who have the mutation. It depends on the accuracy of the test. So we have a codependency between those two technologies, and that brings brings up some interesting issues in terms of how we assess those from a health technology assessment perspective. E-health is another emerging issue for us because of the differences in how we might think about particularly the benefits around e-health. We saw through the COVID pandemic, still ongoing for many, that the emergence of e-health meant that many were saying e-health is fantastic. We can get access for patients to care where we otherwise couldn't. The big question is was the shift to e-health and using telemedicine for otherwise face-to-face services delivering the same outcomes that it otherwise would have? Were patients actually receiving the same care that they otherwise would have received if they were able to experience care in a face-to-face environment? What are the other aspects of e-health that we might want to value or not value? And how might we capture those in an assessment framework? Other aspects to think about in terms of defining what a technology is to look at what it is that we're actually aiming to influence in implementing the technology. Generally, it's about improving health and quality of life, but we might want to take more expansive definitions of some of those things. And there is a strong movement at the moment around expanding what we mean by quality of life. So we might want to be thinking about things like convenience, for example, and looking at the patient experience as part of those benefits when we're thinking about what the impacts of technologies actually are. There's a little bit of a, I'm not going to say myth, but many people think of technologies as always having to be innovative. It's not necessarily the case that all technologies are innovative. It might be an old technology that's being used in a new way or in a new indication, or that we're thinking about slightly differently. And that's important when we're coming to the assessment, because we shouldn't necessarily close ourselves to thinking about an existing technology in a different way and seeing the benefits of that technology slightly differently. And finally, when we're looking at these questions about technologies, we do need to think about how they're going to be funded and how they're going to be delivered, because that influences how we think about making them available. A good example here is the proliferation of CAR-T therapies, where the funding and delivery arrangements have been key to how they have been implemented throughout the world. And influenced how widely they've become, how widely they've been able to be made available. Underpinning our desire for this consistency and for a stable framework is that we know that as health technologies have proliferated, and I do use that word proliferated, we know that we have seen healthcare costs increase. You only need to look at examples of countries like the United States, where they don't have a very good framework for health technology assessment to understand what leaving some of these decisions around health technology assessment and implementation to the market can actually do to healthcare costs. We know that healthcare costs there are much, much higher than they are in countries like Australia and the UK and Canada, where we do have a much more centralized way of deciding which technologies to be introduced and how they should be assessed. The last point on this slide is, and I have to say this because I'm often asked this question, health technology is not restricted to digital interventions. I say that because quite often when I talk to people, particularly in engineering or the biotech space, they have a view that anything that has the word technology in it must be about digital, and it's not. So health technology is about, all of these interventions that I've just described. It does include, of course, digital interventions, but it isn't limited to those interventions. If we think about once these interventions have actually been developed and these technologies have been developed, we then have to think about, well, okay, how do they actually become available to patients? How is it that something goes from being a twinkle in an investigator's eye to actually being made available to patients in a clinic? Well, This does vary, and I'll show you when we get to talking about the Australian HTA context, how it does vary depending on the type of technology and how it's going to be used. And it does vary depending on the funding arrangements for different types of technologies. So we have different streams that fund different types of technologies, and that will influence how those technologies are introduced. So we'll park that one for just a second. But making them available really does come back to those 4 kind of questions I posed right at the start when we looked at those news headlines around, is it safe? Is it effective? Is it cost effective? And can we afford to introduce this as a society? A decision then has to be, to introduce something, we then have to decide, how are we going to fund this, publicly or privately? We've kind of, as a society in Australia, collectively decided to do this in most cases, publicly, not always. And health technology assessment plays a big part of that. I wanted to show you this definition of health technology assessment, not to bore you by reading all of the words on this page, but to show you some key elements of what actually falls into the health technology assessment as a principle. So some of the takeaways from here is that it is a systematic evaluation of the technology. So it gives us a framework in which we can compare all of the elements of the technologies in terms of all of their effects, so their outcomes, their costs, their safety, and it does provide us with a really very robust, systematic way to do that. And it does it in a way that we can inform policy making. That's really, really critical. So HTA isn't just an academic process. It has a very distinct and very clear aim of informing policy about technology in healthcare. I think that's important because for some people do see HTA as something that is done in ivory towers, but it isn't. It is about us helping to make decisions in how we introduce care. Milton, we can make a comparison against the no treatment option if that is what we'd actually do in practice. We would always compare against something, yeah. But if no treatment, i.e. watch and wait, is what we would do currently, then that is what we would compare with, yeah. So we wouldn't necessarily do no treatment against the standard of care if there is a standard of care, yeah. But we could just do no treatment if that is the current practice. I hope that makes sense, Milton.
Thank you.
Some other takeaways on this definition is that we are interested in all of the consequences within the introduction of a health technology assessment. So we want to know about direct consequences, so how it impacts on someone's health directly, how it impacts on costs directly, and I'll come to those things again in a little while, but potentially also indirect impacts. So in how it's impacting on things like, well, how are people affected in terms of capacity to work? How might it be impacting on carers' abilities to carry on with usual activities? Now, the extent to which we might be interested in some of those indirect consequences is governed by what we call the perspective that we might take in this sort of analysis, and that will differ under different situations. But the general idea is that we do look at those direct and indirect consequences, and we also, very importantly, look at the unintended consequence. Now, most clearly, unintended consequences are things like adverse effects. Nobody intends for there to be negative health impacts from a new technology. It's an unintended consequence, but it's important we capture them because we don't want to be supporting a technology that looks like it's effective but does lots and lots of harm. That would be a very bad thing for us to be doing. Finally, as I say, this is an explicit analytical framework that we adopt within health technology assessment, and it's not just done by one group of people. It is done by an interdisciplinary group, and that group consists of people like So people who from clinical medicine, so doctors, biostatisticians, epidemiologists, people like myself, health economists, people with a healthcare policy background, and decision sciences. And they all work together to to coalesce all of the information about a technology, all of that comparative information in that system, through that systematic framework, to be able to inform healthcare decision making about, is a technology safe, is it effective, is it cost effective, and should we support or recommend a decision to introduce this technology into practice. By doing it in that way, we're considering all of these, a raft of frames, not just economic, but we're thinking about it from a medical, social, and ethical perspective, thinking about many aspects of introducing a technology, not just whether or not it represents value for money. And that's really important because it's not about one number, as many people think, but many aspects about the introduction of a technology that go into a health technology assessment. So we need HTA as a framework and as an approach to evidence to ensure that we are being systematic in looking at these comparative benefits, comparative harms, and the value of technologies. I've stressed that word comparative here because we are, as Milton said, always thinking about comparing one option with another. Sometimes that other option is the do nothing option, because it might be that at the moment there isn't, that we aren't currently implementing an intervention for a particular indication, and therefore what we will be replacing is the do nothing option. That is still a relevant comparison and one we would still make. As I said before, we do the health technology assessment to advise policy, and that's critical. It's not just an academic exercise. It's not about getting publications, but it's about informing policy so that we can make decisions about introducing healthcare to ultimately provide access to technologies for patients and for consumers. And that's important because ultimately we want to ensure that patients and consumers have access to the right health technologies in the right way. Part of the framework here is also about ensuring that we're not recommending or not making recommendations that lead to a health system that becomes so over bloated and so full of technologies that promise much and deliver little that it becomes unsustainable. So in thinking about those four key questions of safety, efficacy, cost effectiveness, and affordability, we're also helping to address this question about sustainability, about making a health system that is sustainable and is going to be able to continue to invest in new technologies and able to continue to deliver access to care for patients and consumers in the longer term. Because we do want to ensure that we've got that ongoing access and that we are able to in some way think about, okay, we've got new technologies coming on board. How are we going to think about the introduction of those new technologies? Which ones are we going to make a priority relative to what we're doing currently? Potentially, how might we think about other technologies that are coming down the pipeline and how might that influence the decisions that we're making now? So HTA, as you can see, is a really, really important, part of this, the whole process of making technologies available and in how we introduce technologies. Here on the slide now, you can see an overview of what a HTA process looks like, and this is something we developed for another project we did for the Japanese group on HTA, and it essentially breaks it down into a number of steps and how we can think about HTA in slightly different ways. So we've got, as part of the process, we know that we need to have technologies actually registered. So as part of that process, we have the market regulation and technology must be registered. We then have steps around, well, should a technology be reimbursed? And once we've had a decision about reimbursement, then potentially there's another step about, well, how do we actually price the technology? And then following that, we have a decision to actually list. And in many countries, including Australia, that decision about the listing is actually made by the minister or cabinets. Recommendations for whether something should be listed come from a HTA authority, and I'll explain that when I describe the PBAC and its process. But the HTA process doesn't stop there. It's not that we release technologies and make them available and don't think about them any further. HTA is also interested in this in the longer term and how technologies are actually used in practice. That's quite critical, because what we do know and what we do understand is that within the context of a clinical trial, we have a quite controlled environment, and a technology is used in a very controlled way in a very select patient group for a very select period of time. When that technology enters the market, we have a less controlled population in whom that technology is being used. It might be used in a slightly different way than intended in the clinical trial, and might be used for a period of time that's different, so people may not be as compliant. All of that means we might see outcomes that are different to what we saw in the clinical trial. We might see harms that are different, or we might see fewer people actually use a technology than anticipated for whatever reason. A good example here are the antiretrovirals for hepatitis C, where on the basis of the clinical trials, there was a very high uptake anticipated, but when they were actually released into clinical practice, we've observed a much lower utilization than expected because of the nature of, because of how patients who are actually eligible for those medicines interact with the healthcare system. And so that wasn't necessarily factored into that initial assessment process. So we want to be able to assess that as part of what we call post-market surveillance, to then be feeding back into our HTA process of, well, have we got it right? Do we need to be thinking about this evidence in a slightly different way? So the HTA process is often ongoing, thinking about things pre their registration, all the way after they've actually been made available as a funded technology. Through all of that, you would have heard me talk about some possible different ways that HTA provides an output into the system. And around the world, these outputs differ slightly. So we have some agencies will provide their output as in a form of guidance. So for example, CADIF in Canada provide theirs as guidance on how a drug might be used in practice. In the UK, we have NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Health and Excellence, who provide mandatory implementation of their recommendations for the NHS services. So slightly differently, they say, okay, we've now recommended this, you have to implement it, find the money and do it. In Australia, what we have is the PBAC, who make a recommendation to the Minister of Health on whether something should be added to the PBS, similarly with the MSAC and the MBS. It's up to the Minister to then actually to endorse that decision or to take it to the Cabinet for endorsement, but ultimately the decision lies with the Minister to enact a positive recommendation from those committees. Can't work the other way around. The Minister can't decide to enact a negative recommendation or a rejection. So the Minister can't choose to list something that the committees have rejected unless the Minister finds money outside of the MBS and PBS pots. So it is possible, but then it's not actually funded through the centralised pots of money. So I've been talking about making technologies available. We can actually use HTA the other way around, which is to withdraw public subsidy from technologies, and indeed this has been done in Australia. We've seen recently through the MBS that a number of MBS items have been withdrawn. We've previously seen it with the PBS, where medicines have been withdrawn from the PBS because it's been determined that they're either no longer used or they have been superseded by more cost-effective options, and therefore it's no longer cost-effective to make those medicines available. So we can use health technology assessment to say, is it still value for money to fund this technology through the public system? It's challenging to make those decisions about disinvestment. And it's challenging because quite often, while we can at a population level say that a service is no longer cost effective, there will typically be a proportion of patients using a service or a technology for whom it is safe and effective and potentially cost effective for that individual, but at a population level, it has ceased to be particularly cost effective. So there will always be some individuals who might be disadvantaged by a disinvestment decision, but at a population level, it is the right decision to make. A challenging decision for anyone in the policy sphere to make, but HTA is an important input into that process. Okay, so I talked about some of the different agencies, and in Australia we have two key agencies, PBAC, so Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, the Medicare Services Advisory Committee. We have a third key central agency in terms of reimbursement, which is the Prostheses List Advisory Committee. That committee is just about to be reformed under a new structure. So I won't say anything more on that for the moment. And those committees look at questions around what technologies and services are we going to recommend to the minister that be funded, for whom, and then give the departments some recommendations around what prices should be negotiated. They also give recommendations around who, so the agencies make those decisions. We as a population, of course, benefit from the decisions that those agencies make. We as a population, as consumers and as patients, we benefit because we then have access to these new technologies that are being made available. I would like to think that we're not being harmed by those technologies if they're being used in the right way, but that hopefully we are getting better in terms of health, and potentially that there is some sort of societal benefit in knowing that we live in a society where new treatments can be made available. Of course, the other group that think that benefits from these technologies being made available are those who produce the technologies. So pharma companies, medtech companies, the producers of diagnostics, they all benefit from these technologies being made available. And we shouldn't forget about their involvement in this process, because it's an important involvement. They often are the ones who have adopted the risk for development of these technologies and have introduced them, albeit with a profit motive. We need to acknowledge that. But they also benefit from these technologies being made available in terms of higher sales and profits. I highlight this because it means that the conduct and implementation of health technology assessment often reflects tensions between these three groups. So we've got HTA agencies who are trying to make decisions on the best available evidence. We've got a population who anticipates and wants to benefit from new technologies and often wants to have those technologies as soon as they've heard about them. And then we have producers who, of course, want to have their technologies made available as a publicly subsidised technology because they know that that's the best way for them to make sales in a country like Australia. So all of those kind of tensions are there in the system, and we need to be cognizant of those in the HTA space because they might pull in slightly different directions at times, and they do need to be thought about when thinking about how the evidence is weighed. So how do we actually pull this evidence together? Well, here's this framework that I've been referring to, and there's four basic, he says, four key stages that we would go through. The first is to think about, well, what's the actual health technology assessment question? What's the policy question that I'm interested in? The second is, well, what data do I have? Where's the evidence to actually support the introduction of this technology for the indication that is being sought? And you can see the types of questions there that are being asked, and that evidence really focuses around the safety, efficacy, and clinical and cost effectiveness question, clinical effectiveness question. And potentially how we're expecting that it might change practice down the line. Then we're going to think about, well, okay, let's appraise this evidence. Is it good evidence? Has it been developed in the right way? Has it been summarised in the right way? Is there a question here about value for money in terms of comparing costs and outcomes of the two, of what the new technology is relative to how we do things now? And if there is that question, do we have good data to conduct an economic evaluation, and what does it tell us? Does it represent good value for money? And then the final part of that step is to actually, make some sort of recommendation around whether a technology is worthwhile investing in. Does it represent a safe, effective, and cost-effective technology for a country to invest its monies in, or indeed to be de-invested from? When we're thinking about the policy, that initial question of, well, what is this policy question that we're interested in? It's important to think about the purpose of the technology, because as I said right at the start, these technologies can do many different things, and that will influence the way that we approach the health technology assessment and the way that we approach the question outright. And you can see here that I've listed some common groupings of how we can think about the purpose of a technology in terms of preventing something. So, a great example here is, COVID vaccine, where we want to prevent people from getting sick. We can have screening technologies where we want to find either detect a disease or find people with a particular condition. We have diagnostic technologies and diagnostic services where we want to be able to find people who might benefit from a particular treatment. Of course, we have treatments, and this is where the bulk of our technologies, particularly in the drug space, are used, where we want to alleviate an existing health condition or avoid someone getting worse. And many of us can think of lots of examples there. And then finally, we might have interventions that are designed around restoring someone's health or improving how well they are able to function. So basically around rehabilitation. And we need to think about this purpose, because it is going to influence how we assess the technology in terms of defining the question, and also in terms of the different pathways for that funding. So, for example, if it's a drug that's based for treatment, then we know that's going to be a PBS funding stream, because that's where drugs are funded. If it's a diagnostic based on a blood test, then we know that will go down the MSAC route, because diagnostics based on a blood test go through the Medical Services Advisory Committee, because that would fall under an MBS item number. Now, that takes knowledge about the system, but that's why it's important to, first of all, think about what's the purpose of this technology, and then that will help you determine which funding stream to go down. Also, part of determining this initial question is thinking about the problem from what we call the PICO approach. So, who are the patients or the problem that we're going to be affecting with this intervention? What is the actual intervention? So, what is the intervention that I'm seeking to introduce, or the technology that I'm seeking to introduce? And then, importantly, what's the comparator that I'm going to replace when I introduce this new intervention or this new technology? And that's really critical, particularly when it comes time to do an economic evaluation, that I want to make sure I've chosen the right comparator. There are many examples where people have chosen a comparator that suits them because it makes them look good, but it's not necessarily the comparator that reflects what's happening in practice, because we want to choose the comparator that is what we will replace if this technology is introduced into clinical practice. The final thing is to think about, well, what's my metric of outcome here? What is my endpoint of interest with respect to assessing whether or not this particular technology works? And we might have some different metrics of outcome depending on whether we're looking at it from a clinical or cost effectiveness endpoint, and that's really important. think about when we go through the HTA, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay. I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on the clinical evidence. We'll come back to this in webinar 3. But essentially, most HTA evidence have a preference for data that comes from phase 3 randomized controlled trials or the equivalent sort of systematic reviews that represent a very, very high level of evidence. And that is because they want to be, as much as possible, confident that they are looking at an unbiased, large representative, unbiased as possible body of evidence for a technology, and that evidence has been collected in a robust way that best reflects how a technology is likely to work in practice. That doesn't mean that evidence from other types of studies doesn't have a place. It certainly does, and it certainly has been used in health technology assessment with lots of caveats around it, and understanding that evidence from other types of studies carries with it potential biases and has its own shortcomings. So you can see here that other types of evidence that is available, and they have all been used. And indeed, it might be the case that evidence from all of these types of studies might be used in the one HTA assessment for a particular intervention, just at different points. Around all of the evidence that is considered in a HTA, there will always be questions around, well, do I have all the data? Has the assessment of this technology been selective in that they're only showing us the data for the particular studies where it was positive? Are there studies where the outcomes were not as expected, in which case it would cause great concern to an authority if that was to be revealed? Do we have evidence from a very, very short time period where this particular intervention might be used over a long time period, in which case it's not mature, and so we're uncertain about what the long-term effects might be, both in terms of safety and efficacy outcomes, and so we might want to wait for a much longer time point before we make a decision about whether a technology is worthwhile investing in. Has there been any question of bias in either how the study has been conducted? So, for example, is there some sort of break in the randomization process, or in how in differences across sites in how the study was implemented that might impact on the outcomes in some sites relative to others, or in some study arms relative to the other study arm, which reduces our confidence in our ability to say that the intervention is better or worse than the comparison, and so we're concerned about potential for bias in the evidence. And finally, and I alluded to this earlier, the authorities are going to be asking the question about, well, does this reflect how we think this technology will be implemented in local practice, and how we think it will how efficacious it will be in local patients. I remember an example from many years ago. There was very well conducted evidence from trials in Eastern Europe. It was a cardiovascular technology. The trials were well conducted, as I said, large studies. But when they looked at the patient population and the characteristics of that patient population, and they also looked at the other background therapies that those patients were receiving, they realized that those characteristics, together with the background medications the patients were receiving, meant that the effects seen in the trial were unlikely to translate to the Australian population that this particular technology wanted to be used in, by virtue of the characteristics of Australian patients, and that they weren't going to be receiving the same background medications and treatments as the patients in the trial. So that issue of applicability becomes quite important, particularly when we've got trials conducted overseas, in thinking about, well, will we see the same effects here? That doesn't mean that we need to have all trials conducted in Australia, not by any means. But it does mean that in looking at evidence from an HTA perspective, we need to think about how applicable those results are to the local context. And if we think there might be issues in applicability, potentially to reveal those and bring to light issues so that agencies can be thinking about, well, is that going to be a big issue for us to think about? I said that earlier. So value for money is a key consideration in health technology assessment. And here I'm talking about, well, what are we willing to pay for outcomes from a particular technology? And we ask this question because we need to understand that we can't invest in everything. Yep, we can't invest in all technologies that arrive at the door of the health technology assessment agencies or the minister, because, you know, funds are not limitless. We need to make a choice in terms of how we allocate healthcare resources. And we know that if we allocate resources in one way, those dollars aren't going to be available to allocate elsewhere. So we need to be able to make some choices in some way about where we allocate resources, recognizing that once allocated to one particular intervention, they're not going to be available to allocate elsewhere. And part of all that is also understanding that when we invest in the technology, there are going to be consequences. Sometimes we're going to, and hopefully more often than not, we're going to make people feel better and we're going to improve health, but at other times where we're potentially going to cause some harm. And we want to ensure that the good outweighs the bad when we're making those investments. The way that we look at that question for value for money in an HTA context, and indeed outside of the HTA context, is to use economic evaluation. Many of you are familiar with this. It's how we balance that comparison of costs and outcomes of two ways of looking at the same problem. So, for example, if we have two ways of screening for cervical cancer, and here I'm comparing liquid-based cytology, which is relatively new, with the older method of Pap testing. We can look at the cost per new case detected, but comparing those two methods in terms of cervical cancer screening, and that would be how we could formulate a cost-effectiveness question in the space of cervical cancer screening. And we can do that for any technology that we're seeking to look at from an HTA perspective. Where within that framework, we're always comparing alternatives, because we always want to know if something represents value for money relative to what we're replacing. As I said before, that might be doing nothing. We're always thinking about how resources might otherwise have been used. So how would the resources be used if they were to be invested in this intervention, or if they weren't invested in this intervention? And we want to make a comparison of that use. And we want to know what the consequences are, good and bad, with and without the intervention. As much as possible, we try to take a broad societal context, which means we try to look at all the direct and indirect effects if possible. Now, in many cases, what happens is that the HTA authorities ask us to take a step back and look at a health system context, i.e. what are the impacts to the health system, because they are the ones that are most measurable, directly measurable, and they're the ones that we are often most certain about. I say that they're the ones that are most directly measurable and most certain because if we think about something like an impact on productivity, for example, they are quite often difficult to measure, and there are distributional issues associated with measuring them. So, for example, if we start to incorporate things like productivity, what do we do about people who are outside of work? Does it mean that we're not being valued or not productive? How might we think about people who work in areas that have different income levels that don't necessarily reflect productivity? The way that these evaluations are conducted, and you can see the types of evaluations here, for it to be a full economic evaluation, we're always comparing costs and outcomes. We have another workshop where I go through these in great detail, but for today, I'll just focus on saying that the most HTA agencies have a preference for what we call a cost utility analysis, which is where we compare costs, the incremental costs against what we call the incremental quality adjusted life year. So that's the composite of how an intervention impacts on a patient in terms of survival and their quality of life. So we're combining length of life and how well someone lives and we want to compare two interventions in terms of that combined metric. So we're not just interested in how long people are living, but that combination of how long and how well people are living. And we use that cost per QALY to make that recommendation about value for money. And that's the metric that's most often used by HTA agencies. It's not necessarily the only one that's used, and it's not the only one that's used, but it's the one that's used most often and seen most often. When those analyses of value for money are provided, and they are provided using this algorithm, it wouldn't be an HTA lecture without an equation. I'm sorry, everybody, and you can look at this in your as part of the webinar later. It produces what we call an incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So if you ever hear the term ISA, that's all that is, and it is essentially just expressing the cost per an outcome, and in this case, it's usually the cost per quality adjusted life year. And the committees think about this for each technology in terms of whether or not it represents value for money. You can see this little traffic light system down here in the right-hand side. There are some pretty easy wins in terms of thinking about these ISAs. And if an ISA was to show that something was both better in terms of it produced more QALYs and it was cheaper, that's very clearly a win, and an authority would be jumping up and down and would be beside itself. We don't see that, the authorities don't see that very often, that something is both cheaper and more effective. They do sometimes see things that are more expensive and less effective, and that's this up here, labeled B, where we've got a red light, and that would be something that wouldn't be considered value for money. Where authorities usually see things is up here in the right-hand corner, labeled A, where something is both more costly and more effective, and that's where they have to make a decision of whether or not it represents value for money. So they've got a positive ISA, so they might have a value that's $40,000 per QALY, $30,000 per QALY, $120,000 per QALY. And they have to decide, well, how much are we as a society willing to pay for a quality adjusted life year in this particular indication? And I'm going to come back to that, answer that question in the context of Australia in a little while, because I'm now going to take us through HTA in practice here in Australia. Are there any questions or comments about what I've just been through in that first part of the webinar? Can't see hands. Now I can see if there are hands. Hopefully people are still awake. Okay, so let me go on. So in Australia, as I said previously, Australia, and you can see here the main HTA agencies listed. I've also shown the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is kind of, if you like, the first cab off the rank, which answers that question about registration, which is critical in making technologies available. I've also put into here the HTA, the counterpart HTA agencies in New Zealand, which is important for us to remember in the context of what we do with the Cancer Australia trials groups, because many of the groups cover Australia and New Zealand. The process in New Zealand is slightly more streamlined in that Pharmac covers drugs, vaccines, and devices all together. Thanks, Naomi. We'll send these through. We'll send the link to the webinar through. That happens quite often, Sarah, where a technology has to go through the process, typically the reimbursement process, go through the reimbursement process a number of times. Usually a technology will go through the registration process relatively straightforward, he says. Sometimes there may be delays and amendments to a registration label, but most technologies will going through the reimbursement process. I believe the mean is that they take 2 to 3 submissions to get through the reimbursement process, but that they are ultimately reimbursed. You don't just get one chance. You can go back as many times as you like. The length of time that it takes is variable. It does depend on how quickly companies resubmit back into the process. So, and I'll show you the process as part of this section of the webinar. So, oh, sorry, went too fast. Here is what the Australian process looks like at the moment. As I said, the Clark process is currently undergoing a little bit of renew, so that will change slightly. The PBAC process here on the left-hand side, they look after drugs and vaccines, whereas MSAC basically looks after everything that's funded via the Medicare benefits scheme, and that's here in the middle. All of the processes, also the HTA processes at the moment in Australia are about to go through a bit of a review process, which will commence sometime soon. And that's going to be looking at how HTA is conducted. For the PBAC itself, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, as I said previously, they don't actually make the decision to list something, but they make a recommendation to the minister. The minister, and they will either make a positive recommendation, which says to the minister, yes, we think this thing can be listed on the PBS. The minister then makes the decision whether or not to list something on the PBS, but the minister can't make a decision the other way around. So if the PBAC has said a drug cannot be listed on the PBS, the minister can't then list that drug on the PBS. They can find money outside of the PBS to subsidise a medicine, but they can't list it on the PBS. The best example of that is Herceptin, which was subsidised outside of the PBS in 2001, I believe, and there was a separate program that was used to fund that medicine until it was brought into the PBS in the late 2000s. The PBAC itself meets 3 times a year, although it has many other meeting times through the year, but its official meeting dates are March, July, and November. In order for something to be considered at the July meeting, it would have had to have been submitted by March. So you can see, Sarah, that influences how quickly something can get through, although a company might have been considered in the March meeting and be able to slip something through very quickly for consideration in July if they had very little to address. But generally, it takes a new submission would take at least a full cycle to get back in. Once a submission does go in, it is subject to a very rigorous process of review, as you saw through when I was going through the HTA process itself, which goes out to independent groups to look at the evidence and provide feedback to the PBAC and its subcommittees, shown here as the Economics Subcommittee and the Drug Utilisation Subcommittee, who also provide advice to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee about the evidence. Importantly, the sponsor of the submission, which is usually the medicine manufacturer, has the capacity to provide input to this process, and they have the right of reply to all of the evaluation reports. And they also have the right to speak before the PBAC meeting, before the PBAC makes a recommendation. Consumers also have an opportunity to make inputs to this process. I won't speak to that because Jo will speak to that at her webinar next week, but it's an important part of the process here. Once all of that has happened and the PBAC makes its recommendation, the process is perhaps less convoluted, depending on what the outcome was. If there's a recommendation for the minister to list, then there is a whole other process that is taken up by the Department of Health in terms of negotiating the price at which a medicine will be listed and the conditions under which it will be listed. So whether it's going to be listed for particular individuals, whether there will be an associated risk-sharing agreement, and that is where there is an agreement between the Commonwealth and the company around how much drug will be subsidised, whether there will be any rebates to the Commonwealth for particular levels of subsidy, whether there are conditions around how much will be sold and those sorts of arrangements. That all has to be thought about. If there has been a rejection, then the company is able to seek further advice before they make a resubmission to PBAC to consider the evidence again. The PBAC can make a decision to defer, so they can defer their decision, I beg your pardon, usually until they have further evidence. In many cases, that further evidence is around waiting for TGA to make their decision about a registration of a particular medicine. Again, I'm going to come back to this in detail in webinar 3, but just to show you what goes into an application to PBAC, they are very lengthy documents comprised of a number of key points of evidence. For our purposes, there are two main parts that are critical. One is the clinical evidence, where we have clinical evidence and evidence from patient-reported outcomes being submitted in what we call Section 2. And then we have a whole section another whole section that's devoted to the economic evaluation and showing that things are value for money, where the costs of the technology relative to its comparator and the impact on the relevant outcome, usually the quality adjusted life year, is presented in great detail. These submissions are quite long, and they take quite a bit of effort to evaluate and understand and provide information to the agencies about whether the evidence is presented has been formulated in a robust way and can be used to support a decision without a great amount of uncertainty. I said earlier that I was going to return to this question of whether or not a particular cost effectiveness ratio would be considered cost effective in Australia. So we don't have a particular cutoff in this country where the PBAC would say something is cost effective or not. Now, while this is a bit of an older plot now, it still shows you that the PBAC has accepted medicines with varying cost effectiveness ratios. So we have some here that are $70,000, and I know that they've accepted or recommended the listing of medicines with even higher ratios. We have medicines that had lower cost effectiveness ratios, so some with ratios down around $30,000, some even as low as $9,000, where the medicine was rejected. So they rejected the listing of these medicines, even though they were showing cost effectiveness ratios that most people would dream of, very, very low cost per quality, which would have suggested that they were high value for money. But we don't have a set threshold in this country, and that's because the committees don't make the decision purely on the basis of that number. We don't make a decision purely around whether or not something represents value for money or whether it's cost effective, but the committee takes, the PBAC, like MSAC, takes into account all of these other questions as well. So they look at whether or not the data are right. So do we have the right data in the right patient group? Does it represent a clinically meaningful and patient meaningful advance in that outcome? Are we worried about some sort of safety outcome? Could patients afford this medicine if it wasn't being publicly funded? What would happen to the government budget if we did fund this thing on the PBS? That was a particular concern for the Hep C drugs, and regardless they were funded. How much certainty or uncertainty do we have about the evidence that's supporting this application? If we make this available, are we likely to see the same outcomes as have been observed in the clinical trial, or are they likely to be very different? Are there other things that we need to be thinking about and need to be taken into account? So, for example, is this a medicine that can only be delivered in quaternary hospitals, and therefore what happens to patients who live in rural and remote areas who need this medication? Are they going to have to travel a long way in order to get access? If they are going to travel a long way, who's going to pay for them to be traveling? Are we imposing an inequity of access in making this available through the public system? How much medical need is there for a new medicine in this indication? Are there other alternatives available? Do those other alternatives work? And increasingly in the cancer space, are we able to target therapy to people who are able to those likely to benefit the most? And this is where that question of codependent technologies has become so critical in that the availability of new diagnostics and being able to predict where certain drugs are going to work best is allowing us to target drugs and drug treatments in a better way. And that also goes to potentially being able to target drugs at people who are less likely to have an adverse effect, which is also an important way to be able to target medicines. So I wanted to just give you a quick case study applied in the area of metastatic melanoma, because I think it's a nice example of health technology in assessment in practice. I raise this example because with the advent of immunotherapies in the melanoma space, there has been quite a lot of discussion around health technology assessment not being fit for purpose in making decisions, particularly around immunotherapies in this space, largely on the grounds that it doesn't think about the patients who are surviving longer, so those in the tail of the curves, and I'll show you that in a minute. It doesn't think about the aspect of hope associated with immunotherapies, and it doesn't reward things like innovation in introducing new technologies to a space where we had no technologies previously. If I look at this timeline, it shows you that and Sarah, this speaks somewhat to, I think Sarah might have left actually. Oh no, she's still there. It speaks somewhat to your question around how long things take. We can see that even though there was a bit of a delay in some of these medicines being reimbursed, it didn't take that much longer from their initial submissions to when they were introduced. So you can see here, ipilimumab was first submitted to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in July of 2011. It had a positive recommendation in November 2012. That's not a big delay from first submission to recommendation. Similarly, we can look at pembrolizumab, which was first introduced in July 2015, and then, nivolumab, I beg your pardon, in July 2015, and then had a positive recommendation in November 2015. So we're not seeing big delays for this particular class of drugs in how long it's taking them to get a recommendation. And Pembro, they got up on their first try. So what was it about them that led to those delays, or indeed to them getting up the first time? Well, ipilimumab was the first in this class, and noting it is slightly different to the other two because it works differently. It works on a different aspect. Biologically works differently to the other two therapies, and it was the first a new drug in the metastatic melanoma space. But its primary issue was that it had a comparator drug that nobody had ever heard of. So it used a vaccine called GP100 as the basis for its comparison in the clinical trial, yet in practice in Australia, how patients were being treated was DTIC and photomustine. And these were not treatments that were funded via the PBS. So not only did they not have any data from the clinical trial for the comparison, so there was no data comparing with ipilimumab from the clinical trial. They also didn't have good information in terms of costs on DTIC and photomustine. So there was a large degree of uncertainty around the extent of the clinical benefit, but also around the cost of the comparator and the cost of ipilimumab, because they knew that ipilimumab was going to have to be used as a retreatment. There was also a bit of uncertainty around the plateau effect with ipilimumab, because you can see here from this curve, for the ipilimumab alone arm, which is the middle arm, the top arm here, you've got this lovely flat section of this curve. But once you've got a lovely flat section to the curve, but the flat section relates to very, very few patients being alive. So there's a great deal of uncertainty around that survival benefit for that flat section of, well, is that really going to materialise? So the committee was a bit concerned around, will we actually realise that benefit in practice? So the way that they addressed all of that was to lower their price, but also they had other data from elsewhere. I believe it was a observational study to try and support the longer term survival gain, to say actually we have evidence from outside of the GP100 versus EP trial that tells us that we will have that survival gain in the longer term and observed in the trial. But they also then entered into a risk sharing arrangement. So this speaks to not only saying, does the data within the HTA framework look reasonable, but in terms of that affordability and access, we're prepared to enter into an arrangement with government that says, if we don't meet what we're expected, we'll compensate you for some of that change. Now, Pembro was the one where we saw that they got up the first time, and getting to that first time was an interesting case for Pembro. They went in and had some very extensive consultations, not just with government, but with other stakeholders and impacted groups like consumers and patients, and had other people involved in advocating for the case of their evidence and in choosing the right comparator. So they had ipilimumab as the comparison in their submission, and that's what they were going to be replacing in practice. What they didn't have was a comparison in their economic evaluation drawn from an RCT. It was indirect, so that led to some uncertainty in the economic evaluation. Excuse me, and some uncertainty in the magnitude of the gain in the early data. Their early data were very strong, though, in terms of the survival gains that we saw. But how they managed that was to have a managed entry scheme where they essentially said, oh, I beg your pardon, sorry, where they essentially said, because we're comparing to ipilimumab, we will list at the same price as ipilimumab, but we'll revise that price based on subsequent data that we anticipate being able to provide. So they said, yes, this is how effective we are at the moment. We can come back and look at that again later. So you can see that so through this case study, I hope you can see that the evidence is one part, but then thinking about how that evidence might feed into making decisions about affordability and access is also critical to getting these medicines in an otherwise underserved population at that time, making that available. And I think also addressing some of those initial comments about HTA not being fit for purpose in the IO space for melanoma. So I'll summarise now with saying that HTA is critical in how we make decisions for making new technologies available. I think you've heard me say this probably a couple of hundred times now, but the three key questions are whether it's safe, effective, and cost-effective. And we also want to think about that affordability and accessibility question. If it is safe, effective, and cost-effective, can we make it available to the population in a way that is appropriate? We're always thinking about how, as part of HTA, our technology is impacting on the patient, not just within the clinical trial, but also in terms of how they might access that technology once it does become available in clinical practice. And Jo will hopefully shed more light on that when she speaks next week. And importantly, how consumers and patients can become involved in that HTA process in Australia. HTA itself as a framework is very evidence heavy. It does rely on having evidence available, and the better quality of the evidence, the more robust the decisions can be made and the less uncertainty that we have around the decisions that we are making. So clinical trials are a critical component of having that high quality evidence available. And in webinar 3, I'll talk about where that clinical trials fit into this process. And I think you might already see where those entry points might be. I'll leave you with this, with coming back to this, but that HTA is a bit of a contested space. We know that the outcomes from HTA impact basically on all of us as a society. So I think all of us kind of need to be aware of being involved in that HTA process, particularly in what we're doing in the clinical trial space, that we are affecting not just availability of technologies, but that in affecting availability of technologies, we're impacting on health outcomes for patients and quality of life for patients, but also that is affecting what's happening in the commercial sector, because that influences their incomes and their profits. And so those, there are all those tensions at play, and we need to be aware of that kind of broader system in which we operate. I will stop sharing there. And are there questions, comments, concerns?